Continuing in our look at ordinary people. We looked last week at Ruth, and I guess I should almost say we looked at the book of Ruth because we really kind of talked about Naomi a little more than we even talked about Ruth. But Ruth's situation, I guess, is what we kind of looked at. And in Ruth, we saw her dedication, her faith. We saw the same thing from Naomi, her faithfulness, even though she went through looked like kind of a down period, but it looks like the bookends of her down period. She came out of it, and because of her influence, we see what a great lineage that Ruth became part of, and just what a great story that was or is. Our person for today, we're back on the men, is John the Apostle. John is for me, John's one of those Bible people that you kind of feel like you know a lot about until you really start to look at his life. And then for me, the key with John seems to be balance, because he shows one type personality and then another. And we'll delve into that as we look through this morning. Excuse me. Before we get started, I asked Blake if he would to lead us in a prayer. Do we have any prayer requests in particular this morning?
Certainly for Kenny and his recovery.
Yeah, Ken, how's he doing?
He's doing pretty good.
Good.
As long as we keep the pain under control, he's hanging in there. So
Good.
hopefully go home tomorrow maybe.
Oh, okay. So Kenny Coleman still recovering. Hopefully get to go home tomorrow. John and Emily, special guests here with us. Well, Dorothy's a special guest. John and Emily Broader. Travel. When are y'all heading out? Today or tomorrow? Tomorrow. Heading to Portland, making a residence in the Portland area now. So safe travels for you guys. Good to have you guys here. What else? Anything? All right, Blake, if you would please. So when you look at John, first thing that we can kind of discuss, or that I guess is what we think of initially, is John wrote 5 books of the New Testament, which are the easy ones. John A, and then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. John is the revelator. And it's interesting that all of John's writing happens late in his life. That's a great encouragement for those of us who are older, that there's still hope when you're old, that you can actually do stuff. He writes his gospel from really a unique vantage point. He's several years later. The other apostles are either dead or close to it by the time he writes, according to the way it seems. He is writing the Gospel of John from the perspective of trying to deal with this teaching that had surfaced in about the years 70, 80, something like that. And by the time John writes the Gospel of John, which is in the 90s probably, this idea that Jesus was just kind of a really good guy, maybe was only spirit, was never really flesh, was maybe not the Son of God, was just a great prophet. That's why John writes all these. John uses so many witnesses that we saw this, we witnessed this. And then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he writes to, it appears to be small congregations, small churches, trying to encourage them. And of course, the revelation is what was revealed to him by Christ when he was exiled to Patmos. He's James' brother, the brother of James. they're very similar in some ways. John, I guess they both kind of seem to stay a little more in the background than Peter, for instance. But there are a couple of times when James and John really step forward in a negative way. Which are, what's their negative situation, if you will?
They want to call down fire on people that shun.
There's. I guess that would be. So I was thinking there's that where they say, Jesus, why don't we call down fire on this village because they didn't listen to you, and Jesus is like, relax. But there's also, and this is even more kind of backgroundy, them staying back because it's their mom comes to Jesus and says, how about my sons? How about my sons rule on the right and the left hand? They were known as the sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, but their nickname was sons of thunder. And which is really interesting when you look at how much of John's writing is influenced by love. The theme of love is all through his writing. He writes about love more than anybody else in the New Testament. It's interesting when you think of John's writing. John writes more of the New Testament than anybody except for Paul and for Luke. And we think Luke just wrote 2 books, but they're giant. So I mean, Luke actually writes more than anybody else. And then Paul and then John. Because John the Gospel is pretty long, the Revelation's long. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he wrote one afternoon. I mean, that was easy. But so what we have with him is this guy known as the Son of Thunder. And through all his writings, we see love. So again, what I want us to look at this morning is some of the balance that John had to achieve. I think for all of us, whatever your profession is, wherever you are in life, we have to balance. I mean, we have our work life, and I'm not saying we live as 2 different people. I'm not saying we compartmentalize our faith, but we live in a different environment at work than we do when we're here. We live in a different environment at home even than we do here. We have to find some balance. I mean, when we think about how we approach God, we're probably on a different mindset when we're in our times of sitting and worshiping. That's a mindset that we might not be able to achieve all week long. That just isn't how. But we have to have that balance. I mean, you're not gonna. I mean, this kind of goes against what I'm going to preach about this morning. But our focus in our worship times is different than when we are on Tuesday at work in a meeting, right? But we have to have that balance in our lives.
I think of the phrase, able to wear many hats.
Yeah, and it is. It's the idea of, when we look at John, he had different, I would say almost even roles. But again, it's the same for us. We have to have a balance in our life. We have to be people who are spiritual. We have to be people who are focused on God. But then we have to be out in the world and we have to engage people. Some people that maybe we don't think the best of. Maybe they aren't the best people. We still have to have that balance. When you think of, and I meant to put this picture in here and I forgot to. You think of the Last Supper picture, the great painting. How is John pictured? Yeah, he's leaning over. I mean, just like all those Renaissance era type paintings, everybody looks a little frail and like they just, like they just got out of a weight.
Nate said he was sitting. So that's how
He's one of those guys sitting there. But everybody looks frail and pale and like they just got out of a Weight Watchers camp or something. But I mean, John was a fisherman. I mean, he was just. I mean, we think about Peter and these guys as fishermen who had a little bit of gruffness to them, a little bit of physicality to them. That's what John was. And again, we see in his personality, he has some, I won't say aggression, but maybe that's the right word. But this idea that we see so often, this idea of love throughout his writing, shows us that he learned that. I mean, when you think of the way John writes his gospel, there's one scene that takes up several chapters. What is that one scene? Toward the end of his gospel. chapters 13, 14, most of 15, the Last Supper, that discourse where Jesus is up there telling them, the world's not going to love you, love each other. Love each other like I love you. Love each other like the Father loves me. I mean, it seems like just in the way John recorded his gospel, that had a huge impact on him. And when Jesus says, here's how you love people, and he puts on the robe and the towel and washes feet, that apparently had a huge impact on John, because this son of thunder became a guy who wrote so much about love. But the thing with John is, again, you look through his gospel and he's saying, here's the evidence, here's the evidence, here's the evidence. You get to the end of his gospel, he says, I've written all these things that you might believe, that you can look at the evidence and you can see the absolute truth of the matter. So his propensity, if you will, for love didn't diminish his love for truth. And I think that's a key balance we have to look at in him. Look at John chapter 1. John is a very black and white writer. He's it's this way or this way. There's not a lot of middle ground with John, and maybe that is reflective of his personality. Look at John chapter 1, verse 5. Someone read verse 5 out loud for me, please. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Themes throughout his writings, light and darkness, light and darkness. There's good and there's evil. Look at chapter 3. I'll poke my eyeball out. Chapter 3, verses 19 through 21. This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people love darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it so that his deeds may not be exposed. So again, continuing even to the next verse, he makes this comparison. There's evil and there's good. There's light and there's darkness. Then if you were to look down look over into chapter 5. Chapter 5, someone read verse 24 for me, please. Still in John 5:24. Just anybody.
Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life.
From death into life. John 6, beginning in verse 47. Truly I tell you, anyone who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone may eat of it and not die. He contrasts life and death, light and darkness, life and death. He's saying it's either this way or this way. Now, we talk about different Bible characters that we relate to. I relate to this. This is how I think. It's this way or this way, one or the other. That can be a negative. I mean, I'll admit that can be one of my 7 or 4,000 personality flaws. That it's either this way or this way. But with John, we see it. We see him dealing with these absolutes, but he does it in a way, and as he progresses, he does it in a way that he infuses all of it with this idea of love. That there's either this or this, but love covers all of it. Love is what has to go through all of it. How does our culture feel about absolutes? What's that? That it's harsh. If you say absolutely, it's harsh. What else? What other thinking is there? I mean, like Richard says, I can never remember how he says this, but the most intolerant are those who are intolerant of the intolerant. I mean, that if I say this is how it is and this is what I believe and it is this, someone else will look at that and go, well, you're a bigot, you're a hateful person, which is really them saying it's absolutely this way. But that's how we don't like, culturally, we don't like to be told this is how it is. We even see it, I mean, we see it in education. We see it in industry. That, I mean, in some ways, there is some good in that, where you can say, here's how we've always done this. Now let's think of, is there another way we can look at this? But even at that, when it comes right down to a finished product, when it comes right down to an answer, there's usually this or this. It's right or it's wrong. So when you look at this idea with John, what we see with him is this balance between truth, absolute truth, and absolute love. And I think as we look through this, you'll see that. I mean, that you and I, whether you lean on the love side or lean on the truth side, all of us have got to find balance. I mean, absolute truth without love is a dictatorship. It is do this, do this, do this, do this, which is some people's view of religion in general, which it shouldn't be that. Then on the other extreme, if it's absolute love without truth, what do you have? A commune. I don't know what you have. You don't have any rules. You don't have any basis for what your focus is. So what we see with John is the balance of both. John uses the word truth 45 times. So truth carries just as much weight for him as love. Again, he uses love more than anybody else, but he also uses this idea of truth over and over. Look over to 3 John. Why did I mark 2 Corinthians? 3 John, verse 4. Look what he says here. I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in what? Truth. Okay, so again, think of his perspective. He's seeing the early church being attacked by this false teaching. He writes to this group of people and says, man, I'm so glad you're hanging on to the truth. So we see in just that his emphasis on this idea of hanging on to the truth. But then look back to Luke chapter 9. Another incident with John. Luke chapter 9, we'll start at verse 46. An argument started among them about who was the greatest of them. But Jesus, knowing their inner thoughts, took a little child and had him stand next to him. He told them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. For whoever is least among you, this one is great. John responded, Master, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he does not follow us. Don't stop him, Jesus told him, because whoever is not against you is for you. Now, this is kind of along the lines of what John was talking about. The whole idea of, here's a guy doing something that we're supposed to be doing. Why don't we stop this guy? The other situation is calling down fire on the village that didn't believe in Jesus. So we see in John this, it's supposed to be this way. We're supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to be with you. We're the ones given this power. I'm not going to try and explain what the guy with casting out demons was doing. That's not my point right now, so don't ask, because that's a strange topic. But we see John's personality, that this is not what's supposed to happen. That it's supposed to be this way. He tells these early Christians that we saw in 3 John, I'm so glad you're walking in truth. What we see there in Luke is years earlier, when he's a younger man, when he's walking with Jesus, and he says, these people ought to be doing the things that we tell them to. So what we see is sometimes his love for truth doesn't have a whole lot of room for people. Again, like I said, the argument that their mom starts, having one on the right and one on the left, whatever that was all about. There seems to be a point where John maybe shows some disdain for people who aren't doing things exactly the way he thinks they ought to be done. Now, again, I have to say that I can see that. If you're with Jesus, you believe Jesus is the Messiah, and you think things ought to be done, people ought to show him a certain degree of respect, and these Samaritans don't do it, that might be my first response. Let's call down fire on this place, just be done with them. And Jesus is like, no, that's not what we're going to do. This person casting out demons, John says, let's stop this guy. He's not with us. Jesus says, relax. Let him do what he's doing because he's not opposing us like everybody else around us is opposing us. So he has to balance this whole idea of truth and love. Now go back to 2 John. Should have had just hold on to 3 John. They're hard to find. 2 John, the first 5 verses. And you see it right here in just, you see it plain and simple. 2 John, verse 1. The elder to the elect lady and her children whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that remains in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. Now then, you skip down to you're still in verse 4. I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth, in keeping with the command we received from the Father. So you see, in this letter, it's truth, it's truth, it's truth. You're walking in truth. I'm glad you're in truth. That's so important. We can't ever diminish truth. And I'm not saying he does, but look what he does in verse 6. Verse 5, it actually shifts in verse 5. So now I ask you, dear lady, not as if I were writing you a new command, but one we have had from the beginning. Does that sound familiar? That's just what Jesus said. And here he shifts from truth that we love one another. This is love, that we walk according to his commands. This is the command that you have heard, as you have heard it from the beginning, that you walk in love. So you see his emphasis on in those first 5 verses is on, truth. That's actually backwards. Truth, and 6 through 11 is love. But there's the balance. And it seems like this is, 2 John is John the older guy, writing later, wiser, more experienced, and says, yes, I'm so glad you're hanging on to the truth. This is to all those who have stayed with the truth, but don't ever forget how much we're supposed to love each other. We had, in a particular congregation I worked at one time before here, there was we did the Lord's Supper talks, and there's different people have different approaches to that. We had one gentleman in particular who every time he led the table reminded us this is a command. Is that true? Sure. It's a command. We're instructed. We have command, example, inference. We have it all for partaking the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. But not once did he talk about, I say that, not once in the time that we were there do I recall him talking about the love shown at the cross, about our response to that love, that our partaking the Lord's Supper ought to be an act of love. This is truth, this is a command, we should do it. Not wrong, by any means, but no balance. I haven't been there, but I've seen, you've seen them on TV, the TV preacher who gets up and just cries, and you don't even know what they're saying, but there's just so much love. And it's like, okay, but what are you talking about? So, what we see with John is balance. That yes, we have to be people who cling to the truth, who know the truth, who encourage each other in the truth. But we also have to be people who love. Because if we don't have love but we have truth, we're pointless. We ought to be monks. We ought to go live in a monastery somewhere. Because you have to be able to impact the culture around you. Okay, so for us, we can't ignore truth for the sake of love. And on your sheet, I think that's how it is. You could switch those. We can't ignore love for the sake of truth either. We can't be so loving that we say, well, there's this in Scripture and this in Scripture. If you don't agree with that, that's fine, man, we still love. We can show love, but we can't. The love that John writes about, the love that Jesus talked about in that upper room was a love that's unity based on truth. That's what Jesus even says when he's praying about these guys. He says, sanctify them by truth. Your word is truth.
Seems like a lot of people have gotten unbalanced on that when they just say, well, God loves me
Yeah, exactly.
They write that as a blank check. Well, God just loves me, so I can do whatever I want.
Yep.
They're not grounded in the truth.
Exactly.
Then they're not actually grounded in God's love because He gives us commandments in truth because He loves us.
Yeah. Yeah, that I mean, we just stop right there. In fact, we're going to. But what John said is that God's the example of that. That we can't say, we can't look at what John writes, that God is love. We can't look at that and say, well, see, that as the term he used was a blank check. We can't see that as a blank check. We can act however we want to act, do whatever we want to do because God loves me so much. He doesn't. I mean, he's like my grandpa that if I break the vase, he doesn't care. He just hugs me and buys me ice cream. You know what I mean? That's God does that, but he has rules. He expects me to not touch the vase. If he tells me not to touch the vase, I don't touch it. That went wild. But it's that idea that we can't use. In fact, that does match with something we're going to talk about this morning. We can't decide that because God is love, that means we can do whatever we want to do. God says, here's how you deal with me. Here's how I deal with you. Here's how you deal with me. And what John shows us is there is this balance between truth and love. Any other thought?
In Romans 12, he says in one verse, let love be without hypocrisy. And then immediately says, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good.
Yeah.
You can't, the world likes to say, well, you're not loving because you're not tolerating. But it says, love what God loves, hate what God hates. So it's just all in one verse.
Absolutely.
Right there.
What verse is that?
I don't have my glasses.
It's verse 9.
Verse 9.
Romans 12, 1 and following?
No, 12. Yeah, and 9.
12:9. Romans 12:9. Love without hypocrisy. Love as purely, as devotedly as you're able, but hate what's evil. I mean, that's I almost said that's Bible, but obviously it's Bible. That's where she just read it from. But again, that's that balance. Love relentlessly, but don't tolerate things that are evil. Don't accept evil. That's the balance that John shows us. But we also see another balance in John's life. The balance between ambition and humility. And maybe this is where we should have spent more time, because this is probably impacts more of us on just a regular day-to-day basis. As John, like I said, we see this scene. Now, we'll look at this now. Look at Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, this is a scene that kind of we've alluded to a little bit. This kind of sums it up for us here. Beginning in verse 42. Oh, wait, no, this is post that. Never mind. But anyway, verse 42. Jesus called them over and said to them, verse 41, when the 10 disciples, this is beginning in verse 35. This is that scene where they're saying we want to have some ruling. James and John say this. Verse 41, when the 10 other guys heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. Jesus, verse 42, called them over and said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, this is after James and John have jockeyed for position, and Jesus gives them this to be first, be last idea. But then, where we are in Mark 10, this is a little ways before this, but then, like I said, you get to John, the end of his gospel, in that upper room where he sees Jesus do this. And, I mean, imagine the impact of that. You know you're the guy who went up to Jesus, your rabbi, the guy you believe to be the Messiah, and you said, how about me and my brother? You talk about a couple of guys you can count on, it's us. Put us right there. We'll be your capos, we'll be the guys that you count on. And Jesus says, you know what? The way to really, that's what the Gentiles do. They fight for position. That's not the way we work. You want the best position, you'll serve people. And John goes, well, that's crazy. That doesn't even make, and then however long later it is, he sees Jesus wash his feet. You think that changes how you think about service? What changes how you think about greatness? There was a point where he wanted to be the greatest. He wanted that co-ruling. He wanted some of that authority, some of that position. Is it wrong to be ambitious? No, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with being ambitious. How you go about it is what matters. I think it's a godly trait to want to be the best in your field, to do what you do to the best of your ability. If it's better than anybody else around you, so be it. As long as you're comfortable with what you're doing the right thing, and you're glorifying God in what you do. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be good at what you do. But when it comes to the way our culture tends to do that is if I want to be the chief financial officer of my company and Blake's in my way, if I have to crush him to get there, I'll do it. And if I have to make up stories about if I have to, get my boss off to the side and say, you ever watch the way he works? And get about 3 o'clock, he quits for the day. I'm just saying, But I mean, that's cultural. Maybe that's stereotypical, whatever. But the ambition isn't the problem. It's the way you go about it. John wanted the glory, but it didn't seem like at this point in Mark 10 he was ready to be worthy of that glory. He wanted just to have it. Hand it to me. Just give me that, ding, whatever. Put me in that place. Instead of living, serving, doing what Jesus asked him to do, and then being worthy of that position. Being the guy who ought to be in that place. But then again, think of his writings as he gets down the road a few years. Go ahead.
Wouldn't y'all say his motivation was wrong? I think that's the other thing that bugs me about this request.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't feel like he says, I want to be at your right hand so that I can serve better. So
Yeah.
I can help out. It's more like I want this nice position.
Yeah, and that's exactly true. His motivation seems to be the position, not the opportunities that position would avail. And it's interesting as you go through this, the next thing we see, the next huge event in Mark's gospel, is the triumphal entry. And you're following Jesus into Jerusalem. What's the crowd saying? Hosanna, save now. They're throwing palm fronds on the ground. And John's going, see, man, this would be cool. I need to be this guy. Then 3 days later, what's the crowd saying? This is terrible. If you're John, you're like, this is a stupid idea. I don't want to be I don't want people to know I'm with this guy.
I think it's a good example to be reminded that they were ordinary men of the time, that they weren't different.
Exactly.
They weren't just born special and for these positions, that you can kind of see if it was a TV show, you call it like their character progression.
Yeah, exactly.
Over time, like John in the end is not the John that you first meet. And it's like, for a person of love to be nicknamed like Son of Thunder, that's not, I just imagine like a booming voice.
Yeah.
That like if he spoke, people listen. That you don't get that nickname from just being, have you?
Exactly. You don't get the nickname Son of Thunder being the guy who leans over on Jesus, looks pale and frail. That's not the guy. And that's exactly it, is that what we see is John's character arc. What we see is him going from the Son of Thunder to a guy in the last years of his life writing his own gospel, his own account of time with Jesus, where he's never the hero. When they run to the tomb, how is that recorded? Peter this is him writing it. He says the other apostle, the other disciple. He never even points himself. He never even points out the fact that he beat Peter. He could. I would have. But he refers to himself as, and some people say that maybe this is some arrogance, that the disciple whom Jesus loved. Think of it this way. Maybe he's saying, look who I was. I was the guy who was asking for the position of power, but he loved me anyway. I'm the one that he loved anyway. I mean, when you think of it like that, it changes that whole phrase. I mean, that chokes me up a little bit. But that's him saying that even though I was this guy who was fighting for position, fighting for place, he loves me anyway. And he never points it. I mean, he's there at the cross at the end, but he wasn't. I mean, they all deserted him. But John comes back. He's the only one that we have recorded that close. So he learned that in order to serve, in order to have that position, there has to be some humility. There has to be some willingness to say, yeah, I aspire to greatness, but my greatness is going to be I'm going to help other people. And if that moves me to a spot of greatness, if that's my progression, like Nate said, then that's great. Because he also, as we see late in his life, he learns the balance of suffering and glory. On your sheet, I have these out of order, and I don't know why I did this. I have he died first. He obviously doesn't die and then do other things. But when you think about how John suffered, I mean, we know he's exiled to Patmos. We know that's where he received the revelation. Ancient writers, the church fathers as they're called, the Nicene writers and those people, record that he lived in a cave on the Isle of Patmos, and that he slept on bare rock because that's what he didn't care. He just lived his life. After his exile, he comes back and he ends his life preaching in Ephesus. Again, church history, legend, whatever, says that he got to the point where he was so old and frail that he couldn't make it to the place where they assembled. They had to carry him, but he still preached. And that his mantra to the day he died was, "My little children, love one another." Not, look, I finally got that place. I've written half the New Testament. I mean, I've got books named out. He didn't know that yet. But even to the end, he dies in 98 AD, according to history, during the reign of Trajan, Nate's kid. Again, according to legend or history or whatever, he stayed with Mary until she died in Jerusalem, because Jesus said, son, mother, mother, son. So a guy who goes from the son of thunder to the guy who writes this history of Jesus' life saying, look at all the stuff he did. Here's the proof of who he is. Here's the incredible love he showed even me, who showed all of us. To writing these letters saying, hang on to the truth, but don't forget to love each other. John, as Nate said, he's a regular guy. He's a fisherman. He's a tradesman. I mean, in our culture, I don't know what he'd be, but I mean, he's just your average Joe. But Jesus called him. He dealt with that ambition, motivation, whatever it was to be ambitious, but figured out how to be both. How to be a person who loved and held on to the truth, who wanted to be great, wanted to make an impact, but was also humble in who he was. But then, like I said, sadly, he also learned that part of that, in order to attain that position, that glory, there's a lot of suffering for him. I mean, you think about it, John saw his brother as the first apostle martyred. He saw all the rest of them killed. I mean, didn't see it, maybe witness it, but he knew about it. So he's an old guy, and he's writing all these things saying, man, just love each other. Imagine reflecting back on that as an old guy living on Patmos going, I don't hate these people. But I mean, just being frustrated with where you are, and then remembering that upper room. And Jesus says, love each other because the world's not going to love you. And he's like, yeah, I know. But that's the idea that I think we can take from John is balance. We've got to be people who are truth seekers, truth believers, but we have to be loving too. And we have to balance the way we are here with the way we have to be at work, with the way we have to deal with other people, and we have to make them all balanced. Any thoughts? Okay, well, we'll stop with that. Yeah, we'll stop with that. Next week is Adam, and I believe next week we have Anna, the prophetess. So we'll pick up there next week.